Hey, Paul, what are you up to?
Work and shoveling snow.
It's no better here in Virginia. Should we just get into it?
Let's boogie.
Are we doing that really?
Welcome to HealthTech Remedy, the show where three physician leaders in health technology tell the stories of new and established companies and interview leaders from the industry. I'm Trevor Royce, a radiation oncologist and researcher with experience in real-world evidence, informatics, and AI diagnostics.
I'm Paul Gerard. I started off as a physical medicine and rehabilitation physician before focusing on reimbursement policy, molecular diagnostics, and market access for AI products.
And I'm Tim Showalter, a radiation oncologist and prior medical device entrepreneur who is now focused on bringing AI advances to cancer patients.
This week, we're talking about Science 37, a company that focuses on decentralized clinical trials.
Then we'll speak with Jonathan Cotliar, Chief Medical Officer at Science 37.
Well, great. Let's hop in, guys. I'm excited to talk to you about Science 37. For our listeners who are not familiar with Science 37, it's a company that's based in Raleigh, North Carolina, and is focused on decentralized clinical trials. So if you're not familiar with decentralized clinical trials, maybe you missed the pandemic because I think that this was an area that really emerged to save clinical research and progress for clinical trials. Just for context, the definition of a decentralized clinical trial is when some or all of the clinical trial activities occur at locations other than a traditional clinical trial site. So this could be at home, could be a local healthcare facility or nearby laboratory, and basically collecting data points from non-traditional locations for clinical trials. And there's some real major access benefits to this. So if you've ever enrolled a patient on a trial, you know that the assessment schedule can be cumbersome. We make the participants on the clinical trials come to the cancer center for every single data collection point for a traditional clinical trial. And so a decentralized clinical trial kind of upends that. And as we've seen all the advent of digital health technologies, activity trackers, I'm wearing one right now. I don't know if you guys are, but I've got my Whoop on. Glucose monitors. I'm wearing a continuous glucose monitor right now. So I'm the perfect candidate for these. But essentially, as all these sensors are available, this sort of technology and related ones really make it much more possible. It's obviously much needed to help improve participation in clinical trials and help speed the conduct of research.
Real quick before we dive into Science 37, let's flesh out this problem a little bit more. You talked about the assessments being cumbersome for clinical trials. What does that actually mean for the patient? How often are you having to come in to get blood work? What kind of assessments are we talking about? I just feel like people don't appreciate the incredible burden that clinical trials can be beyond them already being sick, beyond their care that they're already getting during the routine course of things.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. Just to use an example, think about typical maybe phase 2 or phase 3 pharma study. A lot of the initial screening would happen at one of the sites that actually has that trial. So for example, if you're a recently diagnosed cancer patient and you're interested in participating in a clinical trial, you might actually need to get sent over to a different medical center that has that trial open because you could only be enrolled at that site. And then each study visit, so we're talking about a screening visit, treatment visit, would have to be done at that site. And then for over the long term, you're committed to ongoing follow-up at that treatment location. So if you can imagine you're going to a clinic or a hospital that is 45 minutes away from your house, there's a tremendous burden. And we ask the patients to show up to the actual location. So the assessment schedule is built around isolating the effect of the drug and around the schedule of the hospital and their location, but it's really not patient-centered in that way. And so even finding the right match of a clinic that has a trial of interest open that's applicable to the patient involves a lot of work if you're a willing and able clinical trial participant. And then over time, it's costly in terms of the time of patients and the amount of money even for driving back and forth and parking. And as we all know, clinical trial enrollment is a massive problem. The estimates can vary. You know, I always hear the number of 5% of cancer patients or less participate in clinical trials. And many trials never get done due to poor accrual or take years and years to happen because of it. And so I think there's real promise for making the whole process easier.
In the big picture, there's a general acknowledgement that there's a lot broken about the clinical trial infrastructure and the history of clinical trials and how just like so many parts of healthcare that we touch on this show are outdated and really haven't taken advantage of modern technology and infrastructure. I mean, you can imagine if you are a rural cancer patient living far away from a tertiary care center and you have a rare cancer diagnosis, the number of clinical trials that may be available may be actually pretty small for that specific diagnosis. And if you want to be involved in a trial, you're traveling far distances. And then to your point, that costs money, that costs time. And you may not comply with that experimental therapy or that trial because of all those barriers. And so this is a way to try to address that. And we'll talk specifics about it. But it becomes basically a setting where only certain types of patients have the best access to trials because they have the most resources. And so then you're starting to bake in some of these disparities that we've been hearing about for decades within the clinical trial infrastructure. And because these trials establish the standard of care, you have an experimental arm and a control arm. If the experimental arm wins, you have this new standard of care. If you don't have a diverse cohort or all sorts of patients contributing to developing that evidence, then how do you know it's going to work in that population? And so you really see how these disparities can get baked into the system and how tough it is. And I think that's a reflection of only 5% or so of patients enrolling in clinical trials. And a lot of these professional organizations say the standard of care is to be on a clinical trial. So another way to look at that is only 5% of patients are getting the standard of care. And boy, maybe we could do something about that. I don't know, Paul, if you have anything to reflect on before we dive into the solution.
No, but I was just thinking of, I think it's in NCCN guidelines. It says their position is the optimal treatment for all patients with cancer is in the setting of a clinical trial.
Trevor, as you were going through that, I was just thinking, preach. So I'm totally
Yeah.
on the same page with you. So
As investigators too, we really acutely feel this pain because it's so hard to get patients on these trials, and you spent billions of dollars going to developing these trials and executing them, and then you can't get the patients to enroll, even though you know it's a common cancer and a common problem, and like this is the cutting edge question that your research should answer. And then boom, you can't get enough patients to complete your trial. It closes early due to poor accrual. All these resources have been sort of flushed down the drain. And boy, it's tough. There is a lot to comment on about this company. I'm really excited to speak with Jonathan Cotliar later this month about this and hear his personal experience. But basically, a couple things catch my eye about Science 37. Number one, they're based in Raleigh, North Carolina, which I have extreme bias towards. So I was pretty excited about that. They really had a time in the sun, so to speak, during the pandemic, where everything was moving remote, and it really energized a lot of these efforts to decentralize clinical trials. Is there a way to get these therapies to execute these trials for patients so that they don't have to come to an actual clinic? And the whole world was shut down during COVID. So like the time,
literally no other trials were happening, right?
yeah.
You
Yeah,
couldn't
they all
enroll
closed.
a patient. Yeah.
Totally. So that's basically where Science 37 really became quite well known, but they've been around for a while. They were founded in 2014 by Noah Kraft and Belinda Tan, both MD PhDs from UCLA. And they have since left the company, but it's been around now for over 10 years, which is great. They had all sorts of different fundraising rounds, basically subsequent raises from 2015 on. And they peaked in 2021 when they went public through a SPAC, a special acquisition company merger, with a valuation of $1.3 billion. So there was like a ton of interest in this. I'm not an investment banker. There's all sorts of interesting nuances that maybe we could touch on a little bit with SPACs. But this was like a great example of a health technology company being available to the public market through the SPAC mechanism right at the peak of a frothy market around 2021. So that's pretty much their story. I mean, the latest was they went private in, I think, a year ago, 2024, when a telehealth and diagnostics company called eMed. I'm not familiar with them, so I won't speak on it. But the articles that I read said it went private for around $38 million in January of 2024. We can talk a little bit more about the people involved. We'll hear a lot about that from Jonathan when we interview him. And so I may defer some of that in terms of that conversation. But I will say on a personal level, I became quite familiar with Science 37, or at least aware of what they were doing, as I mentioned, because of their presence locally in North Carolina, which is where I'm from, but also a good friend, Shalon Begg, who was a vice president there and has now gone on to work at the NIH and NCI. And he was one of their vice presidents, and they just had this great sort of post-pandemic story.
As you guys mentioned pretty extensively, the approach to clinical trial participation and enrollment is really still rooted in the days before we had computers and the internet. And so that is the underlying fundamental issue. But why does that matter? And I think, one of the big things is clinical trials are slow and costly. And if you are an innovator, like say a drug company, you have a certain patent duration, you have a certain exclusivity arrangement. for your product. So the longer that trial takes, the less time you have with the drug on market, on patent. So that can impact the lifetime value of the drug. Also, as you guys alluded to previously, if you're a patient living outside of where a big academic center is or a place that routinely engages in clinical trials, it's tough to get access. And there is a lot of infrastructure required to run a clinical trial. So it's not like a community healthcare practice can just say, oh, I'm going to enroll my one cancer patient who's eligible for a trial into this trial. The final thing here is really when we start to think about the world of precision medicine, where we are looking at more and more refined populations, the potential patient selection pools can get narrower and narrower. When you start to look at uncommon or rare mutations and you want to enroll patients with these rare mutations for a drug trial, that is increasingly difficult to do with a small number of people. So you really need to start to think about how you can expand the pool of patients you're drawing from. The other important thing to note here that I think you alluded to earlier, Trevor, was diversity. And diversity has been a back burner topic for a long time in medical research, but really in the past few years, we've seen the FDA take increasing attention to diversity within clinical trials for data that's going to the FDA for clearance or approval. And so, big question is how can we start to enroll more diverse populations? And this has been something that's been going on for a long time, but it remains a challenge, so new tools are needed. The regulatory changes, I think, are also worth mentioning here. Just the history of what's happened over time in this space. People have known about needing to let the public know about clinical trials for a long time. We can go all the way back to the 1980s when the Health Omnibus Programs Extension Act of 1988 created the AIDS Clinical Trial Information Services, which was intended to let people know about potential clinical trials for AIDS treatment they could be involved in. Now, of course, it wasn't on the internet at the time, but even back then, we recognized that this was a problem. And then in 1997, the Food and Drug Modernization Act was the starting point of what we now know as clinicaltrials.gov. I'm sure you guys are very familiar with clinicaltrials.gov. And,
I'm always updating and releasing records and all the things.
It's an important source of information now. If you want to look and say, I see a study published today. What was the design of the study that they initially publicized? But, the way it really started was as an information source that patients could be aware of potential trials they could get involved in. Now, of course, this just told patients where the trials are. It didn't actually really help them get involved in the trials beyond just making them aware that trials were ongoing and telling them where they were. I see this as, we're almost 30 years late here. That was 1997 that we had the law to establish clinicaltrials.gov, and here we are in the mid-2020s. But it sounds like we're really getting some technology that can not just tell us where clinical trials are, but decentralize the clinical trials and bring the clinical trials to people to really help them get involved in clinical trials.
The timing was right for Science 37 to tackle this problem. We mentioned the pandemic and everything moving remotely, but concomitantly with that, obviously, were the technical advances and sort of the comfort of some of these remote devices in our life. Tim, you mentioned you've got these smart monitors that people carry with them. And all of a sudden that became an amazing way to capture data. I can get my O2 sats from my watch now, which is pretty incredible. And that just wasn't possible 10 years ago. So there's this social component where people are comfortable with this ability to be monitored remotely and sharing data and sharing their health data. And then obviously the pandemic supercharged all of that.
The arc of technology is sort of bent in this direction finally. And we're at this point where everyone's got a smartphone. Not that they're all experts at using it. I'm still using learning things from my teenagers. People are accessible in this way. Thinking back during the pandemic, you and I were both at that time deeply engaged in the real world evidence space. And the pandemic and sort of the clinical barriers and lack of in-person visits also affected real world evidence. So we think about clinical trials, but also the sort of data that we could glean to move products forward for regulatory applications was really paused. And I think that's the time when decentralized trials really shine, so that we were having, actual collection of data at home. That's something that is pretty unique about this overall approach. So they essentially have an end-to-end technology platform that is called Metasite. And the idea is that it can help with all of the aspects of clinical trials. So for example, even in terms of patient recruitment, some of the idea here is you're not just dependent, if you're a sponsor, on identifying patients from participating clinics, but really there's a direct to patient aspect where there can be a campaign where patients can be screened and an expression of interest can be gained from that. And then in terms of the consenting and enrolling on a trial, that can also happen through support with this platform. And then, of course, a lot of that could still happen at the site level as well. So if you think about all the stakeholders involved and take it from that perspective, of course, clinical trial participants, our patients, the most important stakeholder, are potentially, you would think, happy because they can have the better access to trials and without so much cost to themselves for transportation and time lost. And if they're not near a major academic center, maybe it can help them get access. For the investigators, if you're trying to run a clinical trial program, a lot, you've invested a lot of time and you want the trials to work and you want to have access to patients to actually make the trial happen. And so it's a win for them. And then, of course, for sponsors, I think what shows value for them is that they're getting their trials enrolled on and completed quickly, and they're not missing data elements. And so I think from all that perspective, it's pretty helpful. Thinking back to the diversity expression that you talked about before, I think that it's a real advantage to have access to patients who don't just represent those who could afford to live near and travel to an academic medical center. Trevor, question for you, since I think you're more familiar with this space, is I know they've got a end-to-end platform, read about that, but I'm curious how you see Science 37's particular technological sort of advantages or right to win and where they fit in overall with this space.
A couple things, and we should definitely ask Jonathan about this. An important concept is that the way we think about clinical trials in terms of measuring endpoints has changed over the last decade or two. Things like patient-reported outcomes, like some of these endpoints are much more amenable to decentralized collecting. Like if you're a patient and you're giving patient-reported outcomes, meaning I'm a patient and I'm filling out a survey about my symptoms and so forth, like that kind of thing can be collected quite easily in a decentralized way, through a smartphone and stuff. Science 37 has clearly been one of the pioneers in this approach. From a regulatory perspective, as Paul mentioned, there's an increasing acceptance for this type of concept for trial designs. They've gone to things like pragmatic trials, decentralized trials, things to try to lower the burden to execute trials. So the timing, hopefully, is right for that, for Science 37. And then we'll have to hear from Jonathan, what he thinks their special sauce is in terms of their tech and how they plan to execute that. We've painted a pretty rosy picture of what they're trying to do and why it's a problem and why it should be addressed. But why hasn't this happened overnight? What are the trade-offs? What are the risks of going totally decentralized with trials? What are we afraid of? What are the threats to that? What would set this back?
The first thing is that clinical trials are still a critical component of the medical industry, and the medical industry is slow to adapt to things. You have the way of doing things, and you have certain business arrangements. And a big thing that we really have to think about is if you're doing trials for, say, drug companies or for medical device companies, they have to do trials that will produce data that is acceptable to the FDA. These trials are big financial risks. New product launches are risks. So if you introduce some sort of new technology that sounds great, but it doesn't really have a track record, that's just increasing your risk, not decreasing your risk. The way that Science 37 is making money is really through contractual arrangements to enable and enhance these clinical trial services. But part of this is it takes time and comfort within the industry for this to gain traction. Some things that might help are, the FDA is right now updating its guidance for good clinical practice for trials. In October of 2024, they published new guidance on decentralized clinical trials, which hopefully is adding clarity and increasing the willingness of companies to adopt decentralized clinical trial approaches. And in 2023, they also published guidance on the use of digital health technologies for remote data acquisition. So I'm hoping that these things will help. I mean, there's still some issues. You have to get a commercial footprint, record of success, and inertia is important in every industry, particularly healthcare.
Completely agree. I think for me, as I'm thinking about this space, I think it's something that society needs and that the industry needs. And I'm just picturing being let's say you're, a medical director on the clinical development team for a pharma company. Although the FDA has written a lot about supporting decentralized trials and that this is an area that we're going, we've seen that before where there's been a lot of publications about AI and ML, and there's been guidance given for real world evidence. But still, after years and years in these spaces, there still are a limited number of real success stories broadly within the space. And so I just picture like that medical director of clinical development choosing whether or not to use this platform, understanding that that would require a different trial design to take advantage of this approach, and that the endpoints and the collection methods would be different. It just requires so much courage, both on that medical director's part and then on the FDA review panel's part, and just openness to change. And to your starting point, Paul, the life sciences biopharma space just is not one to embrace change very quickly. And there's a lot of money and a lot of risk involved. So that's what I worry most about, despite the enthusiasm about the general idea.
Yeah, I think all three of us have tried in various settings to work with big pharma as a collaborator and so forth. And it'll be really interesting to hear from Jonathan kind of how willing they have been to engage and how, are they really actually willing to, put their money where their mouth is for decentralizing some of their processes. A couple things that we should reflect on. I don't think you can overstate how fundamentally different executing a trial is if it's decentralized in the way that's envisioned versus the traditional method. And there are all sorts of things that we sort of touched on, but we haven't said explicitly that would be fundamentally different. How do you do a patient consent if they're doing it remotely? How do you capture their data and treat it with the proper, controls and privacy protections and so forth? How do you onboard staff at a site that's remote for collection and execution of the trial? What about looking for things like side effects, toxicities? We take all this stuff for granted when we're the ones that run the trial and we have it all done at our home site. But when you start outsourcing that or removing where that's all done, the risk for the trial could truly increase. Compliance, adherence, how do you know patients are responding to their assessments correctly or taking their expendable drugs and so forth? So there's just like a lot of layers to the onion here that complicate this. It sounds like it's simple, but it's really complicated. We've got Jonathan Cotliar with Science 37. He's the Chief Medical Officer here. And we have a great discussion lined up. You'll probably hear from myself, Trevor, Paul, and Tim. We've all sort of spent some time thinking about the great work that Science 37 has been doing and have questions for Jonathan. But to kick things off, would love to kind of just hear from Jonathan his story, how he came to Science 37, how he even was in the clinic and got introduced to this sort of career path. We'll touch on all these themes. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jonathan to hear from you a little bit.
Thanks, Trevor. Thanks, Tim and Paul, for having me on. Really excited to chat with you all. My sort of journey with Science 37 was rather serendipitous. I'd been a lifetime academic clinician, sort of ignorantly happy, I suppose, mentoring and writing grants and doing clinical care full time, and felt very fulfilled. But a couple of my friends co-founded Science 37. We had all trained together at UCLA, and I really was in tune with the mission and the culture. And once they introduced me to the concept of Science 37, where we are allowing basically anybody interested in a clinical trial who's otherwise eligible to participate in research, eliminating geography as sort of the principal barrier to research participation, I was kind of all in at that point. And so it's been a interesting but very fulfilling journey from that, I guess it was 2016, from that time point. And I'm excited to discuss that with you all today.
And so you joined before the pandemic. I mean, we could probably talk a little bit about that, how the pandemic really changed the work environment from the physician perspective and industry. But just to go back to something you mentioned earlier, you talked about serendipity and how that kind of led you to Science 37. And I definitely believe in the power of serendipity, but I also think in some ways we make our own serendipity just by how we go about our professional lives. And I'm curious, could you speak a little bit about how you made your own serendipity happen to lead you to this amazing company doing all sorts of incredible innovations in clinical trials, and how your experience as a clinician really set you up for success as you transitioned away from the clinic into this different role?
Yeah, that's a good point, Trevor. I think you're right. Probably serendipity may be overstating it quite a bit. So I've been in academia for 15, almost 20 years. And at a certain point, even if you're fulfilled in any endeavor that you sort of partake in, as you get older, you start to question like, all right, if this is going to be my life from now until whenever it is I retire, I'm going to be completely cool with that. But it'd also be interesting to see if there's anything else out there that I can supplement my day-to-day life with. And as you all know, seeing patients in the hospital, seeing patients in the clinic, coming home, having a little bit of time to spend with your family, eat dinner, and then you're starting your chart work, that can be a cycle of sometimes some numbing of the mind, as it were. And so for me, there was a point where I was thinking, well, maybe there's some cool stuff out there where I can combine sort of my clinical experience with something a little bit more entrepreneurial. And so you're right. It wasn't pure serendipity. It was a little bit of intellectual curiosity combined with a network of friends that were doing some interesting things tangentially or more than tangentially related to clinical care. So that's where I started to think about a life where I can incorporate, again, something a little bit more entrepreneurial. For me, uniquely so, I was trained as an internist and a dermatologist. And so the spectrum of my day to day clinical work and my research interest was pretty broad. And so that sort of unique training background allowed me to have some flexibility when I did join Science 37 to have a little bit of broader domain expertise as it relates to sort of evaluating clinical trials and protocols and patient populations across a pretty broad swath of clinical indications, spanning like from rare disease, certainly dermatology, but even more so in the oncology space and other sort of medical subspecialties for which I was pretty comfortable in understanding patient journeys and sort of unmet needs related to a variety of different indications. So I suppose that background really ended up benefiting my own positioning in a company that was, at the time I joined, 15 or 20 people deep, just, I think, past our A series of funding with a huge growth potential. But certainly I was rather naive in terms of understanding not just, what true entrepreneurship was, but for a physician who never really done anything outside full-time clinical care, what my expectations would be as we sought to grow and basically eliminate barriers for patients in drug development.
I love your story, and I can relate to so much of it, like being in academic practice, and then even the story of having your friends start something, and then you want to be a part of it. I'm also in chief medical officer role, and it sounds like you've been able to really use your position as a experienced clinician across a lot of domains to make an impact at Science 37. I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit on how you view the chief medical officer position within a startup like that. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts for how you view the potential impact.
Well, when I joined as a vice president of medical affairs, but honestly, we had three full-time physicians at the time I joined, including the two co-founders. So we were all wearing multiple hats. The titles, as you guys know, almost are irrelevant at that early stage of growth. And so I'm doing everything from serving as a medical executive to cold calling patients and hopping on early discovery calls with biotech and big pharma partners. You quickly learn more about imposter syndrome than you ever could have imagined being in that role. And particularly for me, I had done a lot of like investigator initiated trials and was quite comfortable with writing my own protocols and getting IRB approval at kind of the institutional level. But I'd never really been in the room discussing at the ground floor clinical programs where those protocols hadn't even been baked, much less, anything more than 1 or 2 page synopsis. And so even though it was not in my comfort zone, I loved the fact that I was going from a place of my days were very predictable from the time I got up to the time I went to sleep to a place where not only were the days unpredictable at Science 37 in those early sort of periods, but like every hour brought a new level of chaos and problem solving that I found quite stimulating. And so for me, I'm guessing that if you did a PET CT of my brain before and after my first foray at Science 37, there'd be a lot more metabolic activity a week or two into my full-time role there than there had been probably for the previous 10 or 15 years in academia. And I don't mean that as a pejorative. I just mean that it really triggered in me a curiosity that I didn't know had existed prior to becoming part of a startup organization. And I found that super addictive and I really enjoyed it.
Jonah, that tracks so much with my perception. And like, I have this hypothesis. It's not very tightly held, but let me throw it at you and see if you believe in it too. But I think for early phase startups, there's something about being a practicing physician that gives you a lot of the ability to step in. And, you mentioned imposter syndrome, but as physicians, you're in a sense helping run a business unit, and you're serving patients and you're interfacing with stakeholders and you're concerned about billing and all the other considerations. And so in a sense, you represent one small example of the healthcare system. And it just seems like you're really well poised to be that T-shaped individual in a startup company where you can have really broad impact despite having a pretty narrow major expertise.
The folks around me in the company, most of whom weren't physicians, many of whom had never really been in industry either, we're kind of surprised to see a physician sort of just jump in and do everything from playing the role of an executive to, mopping the floors or putting away the snacks. And so I think a lot of basically my coworkers had viewed doctors in this hierarchical way, in the same way we as trainees viewed our attending physicians. And for them, as consumers of healthcare, there'd always been that like firewall between themselves and the doctors that they were interacting with, because it was a much more professional sort of patient-doctor relationship. And here, when you're sort of coworkers and you let down your guard and you basically are relating to your coworkers in a different way, yeah, it was just a different scenario altogether. I think people appreciated the fact that a physician was doing cold calls or pitching in for things outside of my domain expertise. And so, yeah, I think it was super rewarding. And I think you build relationships really quickly with coworkers in ways that maybe if you're sort of perched on your own loft as a physician is not possible in sort of traditional settings.
Were there things that you sort of insights you felt like you brought to the organization from that work you had done as a physician in the past and with a physician with the clinical research experience?
Given my unique training background, there wasn't a single protocol that I couldn't at least evaluate and have a reasonably good understanding as to whether we as an organization could support a particular trial in a decentralized manner. And in those early days, and even to some extent now, there was so much skepticism about a decentralized model being created to help support patient access for clinical research. This is long before the FDA had come up with the draft guidance or even their formal guidance on decentralized clinical trial conduct. This was before the pandemic, when a lot of the telemedicine laws and rules in individual states were loosened to allow for telemedicine-based interactions between patients and physicians, in some cases across state lines, whether that was for the prescribing of controlled substances or even just for routine clinical care. So it was a different era. And I remember, there were times when I would hop on a phone call or a video call with a potential client and just not just the amount of skepticism, but the cynicism, and to the point where, I don't know what the virtual equivalent of somebody hanging up a phone would be, but you can tell within 2 minutes of doing telemedicine-based physical exams and shipping investigational drugs across state lines to participants in a clinical trial and doing electronic consent in a virtual fashion, and all of the things that our model is so dependent on operationally, were so far outside of the realm of consciousness for a lot of our potential clients at that time, that I think more than anything, having a physician on that call, sort of outside of whatever clinical expertise I brought to bear during those conversations, but just having a physician on some of those calls maybe provided a little bit of credibility to an otherwise maybe crazy concept that we were that we were discussing on those calls. So I think that was probably the biggest utility that I brought, is the MD after my name, more so than anything that I could bring in terms of expertise. But joking aside, it was a crazy time. And sometimes I look back and I think to myself, and I'm sure you guys do as your involvement in your own, respective startups, is conceptually you're like, okay, does this make sense? How am I going to engender the confidence to take on this call and project a level of assurance that we're going to be able to support their programs? We're talking to these multi-billion-dollar companies whose programs have a lot to do with the overall success of these large organizations. And I'm standing in front of them saying, reassuring them that our model is sound, even though we've never been in front of the FDA and we've never had a trial, filed with using any of our safety or efficacy data to get a label. But you sort of project that confidence. And maybe that was the single greatest attribute I brought during those times.
Where do you think the regulatory agencies are right now with respect to considering decentralized trial data?
The FDA has always been well ahead, I think, of the sponsors, and in terms of their willingness to accept data from a decentralized clinical trial construct. I think that, and justifiably so, they've always been deliberate, I would say, about accepting data. I think that, if you read the draft guidance and ultimately the final guidance, there's a little bit of nuance to the language that they provide regarding non-inferiority in clinical trials as it relates to decentralized clinical trials, and accepting historical data as the basis for sort of comparator populations when you're looking at decentralized clinical trial patient populations. And I think to them is they've always sought for sponsors, whether those, again, are smaller biotechs or larger pharma companies, to at least have a component of their cohort in a decentralized model so that they can compare and contrast the safety and efficacy data that's ultimately generated from these trials. So they were even in our early days, and we were lucky enough to get in front of the FDA sort of at the policy level. We were always lucky to have their support, even if it wasn't as overt as, a guidance that invokes Science 37 or any of us in the industry. But they were always sort of trying to get us to work with sponsors to have DCTs set up to really understand what the data was saying relative to the same data that might be generated in trials where there was brick and mortar counterparts or traditional sites within trials that we were supporting. And so the irony, of course, is whenever we were having some of those early calls with sponsors or potential sponsors, as it was, they would always sort of blame, like, oh, the FDA will never go for this. Or, they would be quite skeptical of a design where you would have, somebody for a cardiometabolic study participate completely from home. And they say, actually, we would say, no, actually, they're asking us if our sponsors would get on board with that concept, and you won't get any pushback from the FDA. Obviously, there has to be a sound design, and there's going to have to be a type B or a type C meeting to flesh out whether this is fit for purpose with respect to a DCT design. But they are not going to be the ones holding us back if this is scientifically sound and ultimately safe for patients. So I think in those early days, we didn't have historical trials to point to where we could say, these are trials that Science 37 supported in a completely decentralized fashion that have been granted a label based on the data that was filed from the cohort we supported. But slowly and surely we got to that point because I think sponsors are more and more convinced that what we were doing was safe and ultimately, scientifically sound. And then, of course, by the time the FDA's guidance document on DCT came out, we'd already been involved with like 10 or 15 pivotal studies at that point. So, I think it certainly solidified where we were as an organization, but it would have been welcomed 5 years earlier, I suppose, in terms of getting, potential sponsors over the line in working with us.
Someone's always got to be the first to get the FDA to come along.
Yeah, 100%. And that's fine. It was exciting to be at that point.
There's so many really important themes to touch on there that you really pulled out. One is obviously the innovative work that you guys are doing and just clear industry leader in this really amazing approach to clinical trials. But two, the idea that the FDA may actually be more open than their reputation precedes them. I think that's really critical. And I don't know that I've ever heard it quite put as eloquently as you put it right there. I think that's an amazing thing for our listeners. Going back to being involved in some of those earlier trials, I'd love to hear some specifics. If you can talk a little bit in however much detail you're willing to provide on a trial that is a good example of this, but also in terms of your product and the technology that you guys are doing. Can you give us an example of something that really demonstrates what a decentralized clinical trial is and how technology can enable it and how sponsors and even regulators are open to it?
I would say it certainly was a challenge historically, and it probably still is to some extent, is that people throw around the term DCT and you don't necessarily know what they mean by that, because DCT can be a single point of technology supporting a single element of a clinical trial, or in our case, it could mean every participant that we are touching in a clinical trial is participating completely remotely from the comfort of their own home. So in that context, we do rely on technology to help facilitate all the types of procedures and assessments that we kind of take for granted when they're occurring in the clinic or the hospital space. And that could be everything from the informed consent to the demography, where you're filling out all the demographic baseline characteristics of an individual participant, doing the vital signs, doing the physical exam, and all of those things we all know historically take place in the same geographic space where a participant is in a clinical room, an exam room, a hospital bed, and all the delegated study team members are coming into the room to do their thing. In our model, table stakes is having a technology that could do everything from providing, sort of telemedicine or video medicine support to real-time data capture, where you're taking annotated case report forms, you're digitizing them, you're building them in a technology platform that allows for contemporaneous documentation as you're doing your part of that visit within the schedule of assessments. And so at the time we started, our company was launched in 2014. There was nothing off the shelf that you could use to support all of the order of operations that are required for a proper study visit in a highly regulated space such as drug development. And so it's different than, a simple FaceTime call where you're just having a one-on-one with a patient like you might during a check-in to see how they're doing with a new medication, or certainly I think an interaction that everybody got used to during the pandemic where it was a FaceTime call or a Zoom call, but you were using your sort of historical technologies, whether those are EHRs or other mechanisms of capturing clinical data, but it wasn't all integrated in a way that allowed, for you and others to do that in real time. And some of that was asynchronous, and I guess some of it was contemporaneous, but not in a HIPAA compliant, but also FDA 21 CFR Part 11 compliant way, which is a completely different level of security. And so, yeah, we had to build all that. And so it would have been great. It would have been much easier if there was something off the shelf that you could pay a monthly subscription for and it would allow you to do all this. But so we spent a lot of time and human power and money building technology that ultimately allowed us to do that. It's all baked into one platform. And so it allows for every delegated study team member to access in real time wherever they are. It allows medical monitors, FDA inspectors, and sponsors to view data in a de-identified way. And so those are the types of things that are painstaking to build, but are ultimately necessary just to get you off the ground floor. Then once you're at that point, you get into what constitutes a good fit for decentralized clinical trial conduct. And I can give you a litany of things that sort of check the box, from objective endpoints, blood-based endpoints, where you're not relying on heavily nuanced assessments. And I'll give you an example. Like for Parkinson's disease, there's something called the UPDRS, which has 3 different parts to it. And there are some parts of that assessment that require a very experienced clinician to assess motor activity rigidity. And the difference between one physician using that assessment and another, there's a lot of nuance there. And so you may have a lot, rate or disagreement in terms of how one patient is viewed by one experienced clinician and another. A blood-based endpoint like a hemoglobin A1C or any number of biomarkers, if you're collecting them in the clinic or the hospital, or you're collecting them in the home, as long as you're using the same method of collection and processing, and ultimately the assays being done by the same central lab, you're probably not going to have too much of a difference between where that venipuncture is originating. And so those are the types of trials that tend to be a really good fit for DCT. In our early days, and to be honest with you, even to some extent, 10 plus years later, in most cases in those early days, we were getting protocols that were nearly impossible to execute at the site level. And beggars can't be choosers, I suppose. So in the early days of any startup, you're happy to get any work, even if it's way more difficult than you bargained for. So we were getting rare disease trials. We were getting rare oncology trials, or even in cases where you had a common indication eligibility criteria that ultimately made these indications rare diseases because of the exclusionary medications or some of the parameters within those eligibility criteria. And the types of trials, we were getting everything from autoimmune blistering skin disease trials to diabetes trials to rare endocrine trials, rare neurology trials. And honestly, we had a lot of smart people and, more importantly, a lot of hardworking people. But I think we got lucky early on. And as you all know, even a little bit of luck early on can trigger explosive growth. And, we like to fancy ourselves as experts. And, we can recruit these patients, needle in a haystack patients from anywhere. And, oh, look at us. We're going to puff out our chest. But the truth is that sometimes a little bit of luck goes a long way. And we did really well in our early days, even though we were sort of commissioned to support pilot trials where maybe our enrollment numbers were 10, 20, 5, or 10. But we did well. And that got the attention of a lot of potential partners in the space. And it led to getting more opportunities for things that were still challenging, but maybe a little less so, only slightly less so, and gave us an opportunity to shine. And so I think we just sort of took advantage of some of those early opportunities.
Clearly, decentralized trials is a huge win for patients. And I'm so interested to think through how your patient recruitment strategies can be different in that platform. And particularly for rare diseases where like maybe reaching patients directly might be more successful than going through more traditional like health center based routes. Can you give us some ideas for the sort of tactics that Science 37 or maybe the DCT field is able to leverage to accelerate recruitment to trials like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one of the things that really is freeing is if you're doing a telemedicine-based trial, and you have broadly licensed nurses and broadly licensed physicians in all 50 states, the total denominator of potential participants who are interested and otherwise eligible for a trial is exponentially greater than what you might be able to encounter within a traditional site, right? I think there's historically, when you're doing site feasibility for a traditional site, you can draw like a 30 to 50 mile radius around that brick and mortar site and assume that 95+% of your enrollment is going to originate within that radius. That's not to say there's anything wrong with that. That's the way things have historically been done, but it's ignoring a large swath of the population that can't get to the site. Either they're not proximate to the site or they have lives that preclude their ability to travel back and forth over the life cycle of the trial. And so if you're starting from a point of everybody is potentially eligible for a trial, when you eliminate geography, it gives you the ability to do pretty unique outreach. And so for all of our trials, I would say there are a variety of channels that we typically tap into, and they're not mutually exclusive. So in some cases, we're just going direct to patient through a variety of digital channels. That could be social media, that could be search engine sort of optimization or search words. In a lot of cases, particularly for the rare disease trials you mentioned, Tim, we work with patient advocacy or registries, or even like Facebook or other social media patient advocacy closed groups who may sort of publicize within those closed groups a particular trial opportunity for a group of patients, in some cases who may not have any approved therapies for the diseases that they are affected with. Or in some cases, if there are approved therapies, individuals with those conditions may have already tried them and had either side effects or sort of a lack of efficacy, and it gives them opportunities to hear about new trials within that same space with newer investigational drugs. So digital outreach, where you can publicize trials for patients and give them the option of participating either at a brick and mortar site close to them, and in cases where they can't get to that brick and mortar site, giving additional optionality to participate in a decentralized clinical trial, is super synergistic with any brick and mortar footprint that a sponsor may have for a clinical trial. And that goes a long way. The other thing is we can partner with referring physicians or health systems, and they can mine their electronic medical records to find patients who may be interested in clinical trials, particularly in cases where that clinic or brick and mortar site or even health system is not engaging themselves in that clinical trial, but can at least make available to their patients opportunities for participation outside of the health system. And all of those typically constitute different buckets that we tap into. The largest, or the other sort of large one, I would say, is diagnostic labs. And this went a long way during COVID when, testing for COVID was happening at, some of the larger networks across the country, and there were no trial opportunities. But we can partner with a large diagnostic entity, and if they're doing broad testing for patients, and then if they're testing positive for COVID, let's say, you can offer up a clinical trial as they're getting their results, and the ability to participate from home based on that outreach from a diagnostic lab is really huge in terms of potential as a mechanism to help find patients. So all of those things, I think, work collectively. In some cases, a particular trial, one channel might work a lot better than the other. It's always hard to predict how that's going to play out, but being able to sort of turn the knobs up and down based on what you're seeing in real time as the funnel is being built for a particular trial and the enrollment for that trial is really effective.
That's fantastic. Well, we really appreciate you spending some time with us today and sharing those examples and your story and sharing your experience. I mean, it's such innovative work that you have. I mean, you've created a whole new area, a new field of clinical trials, and I think it really benefits the patients at the end of the day. So we're glad you could join us, impressed with your work. As a final thought, would you like to leave any words of advice for clinicians thinking about this type of career path, and any final reflections on that?
I think for me, I think the lesson was opening up my mind to the possibility of diversifying my work day or work life, even in cases where you're super fulfilled or where you think you have your dream job. It's always good to keep your eyes open and look for other opportunities and figure out if other opportunities provide additional satisfaction in terms of your work life. And for me, it certainly did. And now I'm just glad I was open to the possibility of doing something a little bit different.
Amazing. It's been a great path, and appreciate the conversation today. Dr. Jonathan Cotliar, Chief Medical Officer of Science 37. Thanks for spending some time with us.
Thanks so much.